Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another author chat. Today, we're going to be talking about poetry, and I'm really thrilled to be joined by two poets, Debra Bertulis and Simon Lamb, both who've had their first collections of children's poetry published relatively recently. Where Do Wishes Go by Debra was published last year by Otterbury Books, and Simon's book, A Passing On of Shells, was published just a few months ago. I am so excited. There's nothing better than getting to know new writers and their work. But maybe they're not as new as we think, because often, as is the case with writing, it's been going on for a long time before we get to a published book. So I'm interested to find out from both of them if that's the case. Anyway, let's welcome Debra and Simon to our session. Hi to
there.
both of you. Where are you joining us from? What parts of the country, just generally?
I'm
Debra?
in Herefordshire.
And I live on the west coast of Scotland in Ayrshire.
Right, okay. So I'm in the east. Ayrshire is on the west side of Scotland?
Yep, west coast.
Yeah, okay. What about what I was saying there in the introduction? You know, we assume that, we've got a new book, new poet on the scene. But in my experience, it doesn't happen just like that. Usually things have been going on for quite some time before it gets to a collection like this. Is that true for you, Simon?
Yes, I have been looking at Debra's author bio, and I noticed that our routes, I think, have been quite different. I see that, Debra, your poetry has appeared in a lot of anthologies and has been anthologized lots before the first books come out. My background, though, I suppose, is more in the performance of my poetry rather than the publication of my poetry. And I guess that this is a culmination of the written side of things, now that it's appearing. And what a fun journey it's been, seeing something that I originally associated with what I could hear. Now seeing it written down has been a fun part of the journey for me.
Can I just ask, how do you think that translated to the page, performance to the page? Is it are the poems exactly as they would be if you're performing them? Or did you have to tweak them for publication in a book?
Publication in a book allowed me to really play with how the poems appeared on the page. I think looking at A Passing On of Shells is probably one of the things that would jump out, is how much play there is where words are placed. And I was really grateful to the publisher, Scallywag Press, that they hired me to typeset the book. And that, I think, was something that I really appreciated, because it allowed me to play exactly with where things laid out. And I tried to give little codes within that of how perhaps to read the work aloud, and I think that came from my performance background.
Fantastic. Thank you as well for reminding me about Scallywag, who've obviously just started a poetry list, and it's great to have another small publisher really championing poetry. Debra, lots of anthologizing going on and writing for what thematic collections? Was that your route in before you got your own book?
Yes. Well, it was actually Brian Moses who's been an enormous encourager and supporter. I sent Brian some poems back in 2012. 3 of them weren't really, weren't very good, but he did like one particular one. And so he encouraged me to submit that to an anthology. It didn't get accepted, but then Brian asked me to be guest poet on his blog, and it really went from there. Brian's encouragement, somebody believing in you who is already an established poet, is everything. And that really did spur me on to write more poetry.
Fantastic.
Yes.
I want to ask you why poetry is your thing. There are many different ways of writing and, expressing yourself. It's hard to make, I understand, it's hard to make a living as a poet. So how did poetry choose you? Debra, maybe I'll start with you.
I suppose it chose me at school, Nikki. I was always the one in the class who who could decipher poetry, and I was always the one who had no problem at all analysing a poem, and I was hungry for more. Poetry has always been in my life. I did have quite a barren time of about 5 years when I didn't write anything. The muse left me, and any poet will tell you what a miserable time that is. You're in a very dark, miserable place because it's almost as though your best friend has gone.
No.
Yeah, but yes, poetry definitely chose me. It's always been such a comfort, and I've always looked for poetry when I've needed it, and appreciated other people's poetry. It's a very, very important medium in my life.
Do you write out of sadness, sorrow, happiness? I tell you why I'm asking this question. Years and years ago, I did a workshop with the very, very wonderful John Agard. And he said to me, do you write poetry? And I said, I used to write lots of it, but I'm too happy now. I can't write it anymore. And he said, oh, it's a very dangerous thing to think you can only write poetry when you're sad. Is he right? Simon, you were nodding.
Yeah, Deborah, please. I'll work mine into my answer in a moment, I think.
Deborah.
Well, I write, I suppose I get ideas from everywhere, and I do have a real popcorn brain. I have a real butterfly brain. I'm blessed, I feel, and I get ideas from everywhere. So I find it, I suppose I find it a little bit difficult to write when I'm sad, because that's when the muse might just take flight. The muse is a very sensitive soul and doesn't like being spooked. But no, I can write in any mood, really, so long as the muse is by my side.
I guess mine was this whole teenage angst thing, and it would come pouring out. Simon, you don't think that that's necessarily the way to be?
I think it's a funny one, because I think there is that association, isn't there, with poetry, particularly, I think, with secondary school, high school poetry, where almost all the poems assigned at that age all seem to play into that. These poems come from a place of sadness or nostalgic longing or want or something. And I think that's almost sad. In fact, in some of the workshop sequences I've been doing recently, the finale workshop always is write about the very happiest moment of your life. That's been my big thing for a couple of years now, and it is fascinating to me. What's lovely, and I'm going to throw this in at this point, is very often at those happiest moments, sadness is entwined within those very happiest moments, and I find that absolutely fascinating as a writer, and seeing that in young people.
Wow.
Yes.
I'm going to go and try that now. After we've finished our chats, I'm going to go and try writing about my happiest time. So another question that fascinates me, being involved a little bit myself in other kinds of writing, where I might sit down for my writing day, 9 till usually 12. That's when I get the bulk of my writing done. I can't imagine a poet's day really being like that. Am I wrong? I guess it's as diverse as there are the number of poets, but I just can't imagine it working in the same way. Simon?
In fact, I would say the only time I've ever stuck religiously to a writing schedule was during the opening of the pandemic. In those first few months, I made myself a timetable that I stuck to, and I wrote and wrote and wrote. And in fact, lots of those poems were the ones that were tweaked, or new ones that ended up in this, because it was my escape, I suppose. And that structure allowed me then to play within structure. The sort of chaos moment within a structure was very useful to me at that time. But apart from that, I don't think I've ever really had a writing day. I think one of the nice things about poetry is, because it's fairly small, usually, is you can give a little bit of time to it and it's done. You can find those pockets. That's my experience, at least. I'm certainly not one for starting and then coming back in the future. I do like to try and do my thing on the poem there and then. I would struggle to come back later with many of them, I would say.
Right. Is it similar for you, Deborah, that you have to
Yes.
work on it and it's as a complete unit?
I'm not very good at 9 to 5, and I wouldn't be any good. I mean, I do have to sometimes force myself to sit down, particularly if you have a deadline. You've got to, clear the decks, and you don't have any choice. I'm not very good at being putting myself into a routine. But there are days when you have to say to people, I can't see you, I have work to do. I really can't. I've got to knuckle down. And you've got to be quite strict with yourself. And I think as a poet, you know yourself very well anyway. You're very in tune with yourself. So you can be like that. Look, come on, I always say that you are your best friend. You are your own rock. And come on now, you've got to get this done. And so that's the best way for me. Sometimes I do write fairly last minute, but I do tend to write my best work last minute when there is a deadline.
That's so interesting. For so many things, when the pressure of time is there, those constraints, it's surprising what creativity emerges. I've always been interested in the links between poetry and the arts, between dance, music, art, photography, film, and so on. And I wondered which of the arts, other than writing, would you most closely align poetry with? You're only allowed to choose one. I know you could say all of them, but I'm going to force you to choose one.
I would choose music, definitely.
Right.
One of the most popular workshops I do with year 5, 6 is writing to classical music. And I had the pleasure of going to the Benjamin Britten Museum recently, and I thought, what a shame if we didn't write to music. And I hadn't done this workshop for a little while, but the children love listening to classical music. They love listening to music, and then allowing that music to inspire them. And they always come up with something completely different, and the writing is so rich. It's so much richer for some reason when they're listening to music. So yes, I would say music, because music is a story, isn't it? Every note tells a story, and if we listen to it closely enough, it's actually telling a story.
I wonder whether that, you were saying there about the writing seems to be so much better when there's music going on. And when I was a teacher, I often had music playing in the classroom when there was writing, background music, not necessarily writing to that piece of music, but just something very quiet, often, usually classical, it has to be said. Otherwise, they'd be hip-hopping all around the class. And I wonder whether it just frees one part of the brain. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I wonder whether it stops away the kind of where you edit yourself all the time and you get into a state perhaps of flow. So you can't escape this question, Simon. Which art form are you going to pick?
Yeah, I don't think I would disagree with Deborah. I think music has to be my answer too. And to build on yours, Nikki, I was the same. So when I taught, I also would have music playing while we were writing. Rarely, if ever, to write to the music. But for me, it created something of a zone in the classroom, some very calming experience. And almost without fail, I would always use film scores. It's one of my personal interests beyond writing and beyond reading. I'm a huge film score buff, and I love how film scores color what we see on the screen. And I suppose I can see some sort of parallel with that with the words we read on the page and how our lives color those words. I think there's probably a link there to be made. I'm not quite sure I've made it, but I'm going to go with music, and maybe specifically, if I can, film scores.
Just as you were speaking there, it sparked another idea. Last year, I was chairing a session with Joseph Coelho, and he was talking about poetry as a wonderful mood setter, in the classroom, that you can pick a poem and you can instantly change the mood of the class. So if everybody's a little bit down and you read a funny poem, you lift that mood within, seconds. And the same, if you need to calm a class down, you can read a certain kind of poem, and within seconds you're there. Music can do the same thing, I think. It's a good mood setter and a good mood changer. Oh, I think we've got so much to talk about, but actually we really want to crack on and talk to you about your collections. So I'm going to just bring Debra in, and we'll come back to you in a little while, if that's all right, Simon.
Enjoy.
So, Debra, this wonderful collection of yours called Where Do Wishes Go? I suppose the first thing that I wanted to say is that it feels to me as though poetry for children is in a good place right now. For years, it seemed that we were, doomed is the wrong word, but we would only ever have thematic collections, and they were often collections that related specifically to things that were being taught in the curriculum. Or we would have the big gift anthologies. Now it seems to me that the single poet collection is having something of a revival. And both you and Simon, these are single poet collections that we're talking about. And one of the things that I love about that is that you get to see the poet in all of their moods.
Yes.
And when we look at your collection, there are many moods in this collection of poems.
Yes, there are. It's a very, very eclectic, diverse, and of course, Janetta, champions diversity, and I purposely wanted to make it diverse. I mean, we're living in a more and more diverse society anyway, and I'm very influenced by what I see, what I hear, the schools I go to, the funny things children say, the poverty, and it's all gets stored and comes out to make collections like Where Do Wishes Go? Which I'm really proud of. I put my heart and soul into the book, and I'm really proud of its diversity and, the many, as you say, the many moods. There really is something for every child, I think.
Were most of the poems written and then you gathered them together in this collection, or did you have to write specifically for this publication?
I probably got about 15, 20 poems together before I contacted Janetta. I knew which publisher I wanted because I knew if Janetta wanted me, that I was not a bad poet. And so I was well prepared. I knew I had to be well prepared. And so I did get about 12, 15 ready, but they hadn't been, some of them had been somewhere else, but most of them are new and were written for the collection. The ones I initially sent to Janetta were new, and then she asked for some ones that I'd written before, and she took a look at those, and we decided that they should go in. But yes, it was very, very exciting, actually writing for a purpose.
Fantastic. We know how editors work with writers of fiction. Do they get so heavily involved with poets as well? I mean, is there an editor with an editor's role?
I think Janetta's a very good editor. She has eagle eyes and she will notice everything. I try to edit work as I go along, but sometimes it needs a really professional eye to say, look, I'm not sure this is working, or, I think I'm not quite sure about that verse. So I tend to rattle them off and then look at them later. But even then, you do need someone else's eye. And Janetta is known for her. She doesn't miss a trick. So that was brilliant for my first collection. But yes, I did have to do some editing. There were some verses which had 5 lines and some with 4 in the same poem. And I got so carried away with the poem and so pleased with the poem, patting myself on the back. And I hadn't realised that, it really needs to have some kind of uniform about it. So, yes.
I think we should hear some of these poems, and I know that you've chosen some, and I also chose a few that I hoped that we could talk about, and I hope that you'll read them for us as well. I wondered whether we could start with a poem called Miss Jazz.
Yes, this is based on somebody who it's somebody I know. I can't say who because she may listen to this, but she should really take it as a compliment. She is very, very particular about what she wears, and every tiny thing, like her earring, the bauble in her earring, might be the exact shade of the stripe in one of her socks. And she is so particular that to look at her, you might think it was all very thrown together, but actually she has been so particular and so careful and has taken such pride in what she wears. So this is called Miss Jazz. Whenever Miss Jazz walks towards us in town, Mum lowers her eyes, diverts them down. She hurries me past, though I just want to stare at this work of art, at her style and flair. A felt patchwork hat of orange and red rests neatly on top of her violet head. A long floaty dress of purple and blue with a sparkling belt makes a dazzling view. She's matched her earrings the exact same shade as the stripes in her tights, blue, pink and jade. A long chiffon scarf, patterned yellow and green. Miss Jazz is a prism, a kaleidoscope queen. From the hat on her head to the shoes on her toes, Miss Jazz spreads a rainbow wherever she goes.
So I tell you what appealed to me about this poem was several things. One was the fact that the child sees something that makes the adult nervous, and adults are often like that around eccentricity in a way that children are fascinated by
Yes.
it.
Yes. I remember walking through town with my mum a few times, and I'd sort of noticed characters that, you just notice as a child, characters. And she would hurry me past, kind of, smile, hello, and then walk on. Yes, I mean, children are fascinated by people like Miss Jazz, the colours and flair and the eccentricity. Yes.
And there's quite a tradition of eccentric characters in children's poetry. I think going back to poets like Charles Causley, I don't know if I'm guessing he's someone whose poetry you have read.
Yes.
And also Ted Hughes, although I have to say I think Charles Causley was better at it than Ted Hughes. I didn't really like his Meet My Folks collection, but there has been this tradition really of eccentricity in characters. I suppose Quentin Blake in his picture book poetry is the same with Miss Artichoke and all the others. How about you choose a poem for us? Because as we said, it's a very varied collection.
Right.
Let's give everyone a flavour.
Well, following on from Miss Jazz, I rather like Mike the Mirror. Yeah, now Mike the Mirror is again about another eccentric character. When I was little with my 3 sisters, my mum used to take us into town on a Saturday morning, and it was that era where you had to dress smartly and you put your best clothes on, and we would meet characters or see characters that actually I'm still seeing now. When I walk through the centre of Hereford, they're older and they're walking with a stick, or they might be in a wheelchair, but I'm still seeing those faces that I saw as a child and that I saw growing up. And so that led me to think, we moved away for a couple of years to be nearer my mother-in-law. And when we came back, I probably don't notice the faces so much now, but when you've been away, you notice more. And I noticed, oh my goodness, oh gosh, yes. And you notice people. And so that led me to thinking about the characters. They're still around. And so my imagination took flight, and then I started to think about somebody who was a local character, who was the rest of the town was very, very fond of. As you do get quite fond of these faces, and when they're not around, you wonder where they are. So this is called Mike the Mirror. This is the tale of Mike the Mirror, who could find his reflection in a concrete pillar. Mike the Mirror, so in love with his face, sought his reflection all over the place. Shoppers would smile as they heard him shout, "Is that me in that window, or is James Bond about?" Then they'd ooh and they'd ah as he found his reflection, put his lips to the glass to no one's objection. Some years later, Mike went missing. He dissolved himself in a pool of kisses. Mike the Mirror was so sorely missed, the town built a statue of Mike blowing a kiss to shoppers who pay their respects each day to the man called Mike the Mirror, who kissed himself away.
Wonderful, wonderful. It's interesting listening to you there talking about childhood as well, your own childhood. With this collection of poems, were you writing yourself back into your childhood in some of them?
Yes, I think I was actually, Nikki. I think some of it is autobiographical, semi-autobiographical. Yes, definitely. There are things I remember, and I was a very quiet child. I was desperately shy when I was younger, and I used to write a lot, and I think it's made me a writer. But yes, and then as I was growing up, I worked with children in care, and I worked with very disadvantaged children, where I think some of the poems come from. This is a great poem. I use this quite a lot in poetry workshops when I go into schools, and children find their own thinking place, and we have some wonderful suggestions. This is called Thinking Place. There is nothing like finding somewhere quiet to have a really good think, away from everything, the kind of think that stretches into dreams.
Mm. And I chose that obviously because it does show this huge variety, but also I thought it was a good launch pad into asking you about your thinking places now. Where do you go to have those kinds of thoughts?
There are lots of places, really. I suppose I go a lot into my head, having quite a busy life, with two girls at university and a busy. I suppose I walk my collie across the fields, and I think a lot then. I do quite a lot of thinking when I'm walking. I love walking. I love walking up hills and mountains, and so yes, I suppose that's my thinking place. Yes, anywhere
Interesting.
where I'm out walking, really.
Yeah. I actually found the pandemic and lockdown, in spite of all the difficulties that are associated with that, I actually found lots of benefits came for me personally from walking. And I
Yes,
had so many ideas during
yeah,
that period of
yeah,
time, and they
yeah.
were always when I was walking.
Yes, yes.
Um, Take us into another poem.
Okay. Shall we have blackberry picking?
Oh, yes.
Blackberry picking, I love blackberry picking. You were just talking about the pandemic and the lockdown. Well, I spent all of that summer, the late summer, blackberry picking. And there were no time restraints, and there was nobody, sort of didn't have to be anywhere, and it was wonderful to be able to spend so much time blackberry picking. And I remember the ones at the back were always the hardest, and I used to cheat and get one of these grabbers, you know, these disabled aids that I bought for somebody when they break their ankle, and I used that. I cheated. I used that to actually get the ones at the back, but it was very frustrating until I did that. It's a poem really about resilience. I see it as a poem about resilience and actually, you know, battling your way through and never giving up, really. Leave me the ones that are just out of reach, the ones entangled by thorns, shielded by skin-ripping brambles, by a field of freshly cut corn. Leave me the ones that are just out of reach, the ones worth fighting for. I'll battle the tall nettles, soldiers, a sting or two or more. Leave me the ones that are just out of reach, plump and black as tar, for those which prove the hardest to grasp are the sweetest tasting by far.
I'm bringing Simon in here as well. He was clapping there.
Oh, thank you, Simon.
It's interesting listening to you talk about that poem because on the surface it may be about blackberry picking, but you've already said there are other thoughts that lie underneath this as well. And I wanted to relate that idea to the illustration of poetry. Illustration needs to be really sensitive, doesn't it? Otherwise it pins a poem down and it makes it about something when it could be about something completely different.
Yes.
I wondered if either of you had ever had any thoughts. I mean, Simon, you've got possibly one of the country's best, you know, illustrators here. Any thoughts about the illustration of poetry and what good illustration is for poetry?
Simon?
Okay, I'll go first. Yes and no. I mean, I think you're right, isn't it? Illustration can so easily damage a poem. And I think one of the things personally with Chris Riddell that's just blown me away on every occasion of seeing his work is it doesn't necessarily illustrate the poem, it illuminates it. It offers something about the poem in some way. And that's why I just loved his work on it. I felt he was so generous and mysterious and cool and funny without ever saying, this is it. And that talent is beyond me. I don't know how an illustrator manages to do that. And also, there's just that lovely thing. I'm looking at the one. Can I show the one from blackberry picking? Is
Yes.
that okay, Debra?
Yes.
Yeah.
Let me just put you up there
Oh,
on
right.
your own.
There's the illustration by Jess Mason for Debra's poem Blackberry Picking. And I think what I really love about this, Chris does it as well, but I love the space it leaves around the poem. I love all that the gappiness down here. I love the gappiness over here. It allows a poem to breathe. You know, it doesn't stifle the poem. Debra, was that your enjoyment of these illustrations as well?
Absolutely. She's a she's only young, but she's a very, very talented illustrator. And I always, you know, with Chris Riddell, he writes poetry as well, doesn't he? And I always admire a poet who can illustrate as well. Yes, she's brought them to life. I mean, I think you're right, definitely. A good illustrator brings poetry to life, and that's what has happened with us both. And we've been very, 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 very fortunate.
I'm going to use that word illuminate in future because I think that's perfect for it. Listening to Debra read her poems there, and you've obviously got a copy of the collection as well, Simon. What sorts of things did you think when you were reading the collection? Could you see connections with your own work?
Yes, and I think you have actually mentioned one earlier on, which was the connection with the natural world. I mean, that was just mentioned there in the blackberry picking. And the other one I think that stands out straight away is the use of characters jumping through. You had your one about Miss Jazz with your colour. And actually, for me, from the performance side of things, watching you read it brought it alive so much. You know, the character
Oh,
was
thank you.
created. The character was created absolutely in how you shared that
Thank
one.
you.
Some
Mm.
and then I guess I had one more comment, which was I really enjoyed poems like this one, for example, which was Jack's
Oh,
Mountain.
yeah.
And I enjoyed ones where there was a little story, and with your publisher, you know, you've put the little bit of text just to say a little bit about it, where we take these stories and we do something with them, where we're not just telling the story, we're elevating it somehow into a little piece of art. It happens there. There's the poem near the end about a star called Krista, yeah, which is about the space shuttle crash, a terrible event, and captured in poetry. I love that. I love that poetry can do that.
Yes, it's
Mm.
wonderful. Poetry can be about anything, can't it? And that's the biggest revelation for children when I go into schools. Thank you very much for that, by the way, Simon. That's so you've obviously read it really thoroughly. Thank you. Um, the biggest revelation for children is, I find, poetry can be about anything, and they're looking at each other. Anything, yes, anything. It can be about Simon's beard, it can be about this pen, it can be, and that's the biggest revelation. It can be about anything. And all our experiences go into our writing.
I wonder, as Simon's mentioned Jack's Mountain, whether either he or you could read it. I don't know what it's like having someone else read your poem to you, or whether you would like to read it, Deborah.
Simon?
Oh,
Simon,
Deborah,
would you like
please
to
take
read
this
one of
one.
Deborah's poems?
I've got two of yours earmarked here, Simon.
Oh
Hopefully there'll
my,
be
oh
time
my.
to read them.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Shall I go for it then?
Yeah.
How about if I read the poem? Maybe Deborah, you should read the footnote at the end of the page.
Okay.
Okay. Jack's Mountain by Debra Bertulis. Jack was obsessed with Mount Everest. The shelves in his bedroom were stacked with books of the earliest expeditions. Hillary and Tenzing were obvious heroes, but Jack's admiration for mountaineers, George Mallory, and Andrew Irvine stretched way beyond anything. I can see him now, crouched on his floor, book open at another page of black and white photographs, eyes glistening with passion, with a voice I never heard in school, talking about his own dream to climb Everest, how Mallory was found without his wife's picture he'd vowed to leave at the summit. Irvine and his camera were still missing. The northeast ridge was the last sighting of the men, just below the top. Had they reached the summit? Or never reached it at all? Jack moved to another school far away from the taunts of his bullies. Someone else listens to him now, no doubt with the same intensity as me. And it would come as no surprise if, one day in the future, I hear about a quiet man named Jack who reached the summit of Mount Everest, spurred on by the spirit of his heroes, and, on his descent, discovered the missing Andrew Irvine.
What
Wow,
happened?
what's it like hearing your poem read by another poet?
Could not possibly have read it as well as that, Simon. Every pause. I used to teach Lambda, and so every pause, oh my gosh, you read that far better than I could read. I wrote that poem, but I was actually on the edge of my seat. I was really hooked. I was listening very, very intently. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you notice my little voice crack there? I mean, it's quite emotional, but
I
on the
know.
word missing, I had a wee voice crack. I was like, gosh, I'm invested. I'm invested.
Yeah.
There are a few bits. May I just give comment for a second? I particularly love the line, with a voice I never heard in school. I mean, that's the line of the poem for me. I thought that was just
thank you.
wonderful, just stunning.
Thank you. Thank
Do
you.
read us that little note at the end as well, Deborah.
The little note at the end. This is what fascinates me about this story. What happened to the photograph of Mallory's wife? Where is the missing camera? Where exactly is Andrew Sandy Irvin's final resting place? If just one of these questions were answered, it could solve what many believe is the biggest mountaineering mystery of all time.
Wow. Well, Deborah, thank you for giving us a glimpse into this very rich collection of poems. We'll be talking to you again at the end. I know there were other poems that we'd earmarked to read, but you've had so many interesting things to say. I feel I must give Simon his time as well. So we'll come to Simon and then we'll come back to you at the end as well. So
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.
And here we are. So we're going to talk now about A Passing of Shells. The title of one of the poems in the book, is it?
No, A Passing On of Shells is in the book, but it's hidden away within one of the other poems called Life on the Rock. And specifically in that poem, it's used as a poetic way of talking about hermit crabs and how they pass on their used shells to other hermit crabs in what's known as a vacancy chain. And when I come across this concept, I thought that sounds like a great construct for a poem. There's a compulsion to write something about that because there's so much contained within the image. And when I crafted those 5 words, A Passing On of Shells, with my editor, when I first read that poem to her, I think both of us very quickly thought that has to be the title of the book. Because what is this book if not attempting to pass on little nuggets, little bits of wisdom, or little bits of hilarity, little bits of sharing? I mean, it's right there in the title, I think. I honestly don't think we could have chosen a better title. I'm very, very proud of it. I'm very happy it's called A Passing On of Shells.
Fantastic. So again, as with Deborah's collection, it's a collection of many moods. I read one the other day to a group of teachers because it spoke to me because I'm of a certain age. I love hip hop music, by the way, but this poem is called Hip Hop. I wondered if you could start by reading that one.
My grandmother went in for hip operations many years ago, and I remember at the time thinking, gosh, it's a big thing, an operation, not just for the person undergoing the operation, but the family as well. And I thought, of a certain age, there's a panic about that. Where's Granny going? And I suppose I wanted to write a poem that was humorous about something that could be quite scary, but also that acknowledges just wait, and better things hopefully are coming. It's called Hip Hop. Granny couldn't dance or bust a move. She shuffled oh so slow, until one day she did proclaim, "These hips have got to go." And so she had some operations that made her feel 9, not 94. Now just you wait, for Friday night she'll hip hop out the door.
I certainly did a bit of hip hopping myself over the holiday weekend that we've just had. So there's a lot of lightness in this collection. I think that refers back to what we were saying earlier, that you can't just write out of sadness. There are a whole range of moods. But there are some very thoughtful, even enigmatic poems, I think, in this collection. And one that really struck me was The Childhood Thief. I wonder if we could hear that.
The Childhood Thief, to me, is an interesting one because it's a little unlike some of the other ones in the collection for a few different reasons. But something I really love about it actually is the title. For me, the title really makes this poem something a little different. What do I think it's a poem about? I think it's my exploration of grief. I think it's the closest this book comes to talking about grief in hopefully a very simple way that you can dig into if you want to. I suppose that's my go-to with poetry. Do you get something at the surface level? Can you get something beyond? This one's called The Childhood Thief. Mummy, look, the sky is singing. I need your song. Daddy, look, the clouds are crying. I need your tears. Granny, look, the light is fading. I need your smile. Grandpa, look, the stars are silent. I need your peace. Poet, look, the poem is ending. I need your words.
That poem feels very timeless. Some of them, like hip hop, are of the moment. We know that. We could say when they were written, but something like The Childhood Thief feels as though it could have been written 100 years ago or 100 years in the future. It has that kind of, timeless quality to it. And
Well,
it
that's a
certainly
great thing
moved.
for a poet to hear, it has to be said. Thank you.
Indeed. Interesting to hear that it's about grief. For me, it was very mysterious, the mysteries of the world, and it had a melancholy to it. And I like music in the minor key, and I think that as I was reading that poem, that's what I was responding to, this sort of minor key element to it. And I was also interested listening to you read it, where your accent, I feel, became more pronounced as you were reading that poem. I don't know. Is that a deliberate performance choice?
I don't really often think about too much as I'm reading poetry. It's a little bit different for me than reading a character piece. I suppose in that one, I just let myself go with how I felt. The emotion took me until it gets that final line. And it's a very solid delivery of the line about the poet, I think, to pull it together at the end.
The poet surfaces quite a lot in your poems as well, I think. Sometimes with the sort of gravitas of this poem, but sometimes it's a much lighter touch. It almost sometimes you laugh at the poet in your poetry.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah, and I think it's a really fun thing to do. I really, really think it's great to put the concept of poetry in poems and put the concept of the poet in a poem. It's just, for me, it's great. And I think you can overdo it to do it all the time, but it's just one of those really bizarre things of putting the artist in the art in a slightly different way rather than just saying, I did this or I did that. I think to use the poet is really fun, and as you've already identified, I use it in this book in lots of different ways for humour, but also the gravitas, as you said, and particularly towards the end when it starts to wrap up and the collection starts to challenge, well, what is poetry? Why do we write? Where is that compulsion to write poetry? For me, a lot of that is what it comes down to. When I read a book of poems, I think to myself, what was the compulsion to write this?
Say a little bit more about that, because it's a collection of single poems, but there has to be some decision making about how we organise that. And you said there about as we come to the end, as it builds towards something. So there's a sense in which, not that there's an expectation that it's read from cover to cover, but that you will get a particular experience from it if you read it in that way.
Yeah, this book, I have been very blessed, I would say, to have been so involved in so many aspects of it, the building of it, the typesetting of it. But for me, the very, very, very hardest bit of the entire job was choosing the order of the poems. It was the hardest thing, especially a poetry collection that doesn't necessarily have any connections through the poems. And I remember first submitting my first attempt at an order of 50 to Scallywag, and there was very much a case of them saying, that's not it. And it was partly because I'd put the saddest poem and followed it up straight away with the funniest poem. I tried to do that thing, it was like bang, whoa, bang, and it didn't work. And they said to me, it's not right. We don't know how to do it. There is no formula to do it, but go away and think about it again. So my strategy to do it, and this is where I'm going to tie my answer into your question, my strategy to do it was to think, all right, I've got these 50 poems. Can I narratively now give them an emotional narrative? And that poem, for example, that we looked at, The Childhood Thief, is very specifically numbered around number 18 in the collection. And I know that in my head because it was a marker for me, The Childhood Thief. There's a turning point, that entry into adulthood. Before that, and the sort of late single digits, you'll notice there are lots of family-orientated poems as the kids are growing up. Later on, there are some nostalgic ones. And I don't think that's noticeable. I hope it's not noticeable, but when you see that it's there, I really think if you read it cover to cover, you can go places with it, which is why I say when it gets to the end, those last sort of 4 poems, I think they are a sequence. I absolutely think that they go together, and I almost can't imagine them in any other order now, which is a delight to me, actually. The very last poem I wrote for the book was the last poem in the book, and that to me told me I was done.
I think we sort of need to hear that one, but not yet because it's the last
Okay.
poem. We can't hear that until the very end. Maybe I'll ask you to read us out.
Okay, that sounds
with
fun.
that. But I would like to hear a poem of your choice.
Fab. Shall we go with? I mentioned searching for ideas earlier. Shall we go with that one just now? Searching for ideas. I think I'll do this one as my little tribute to Debra. Debra early on was talking about the muse and the muse taking flight and when it was there. And I think it's a done thing, isn't it? When you don't have anything to write about, you write about the fact that you have nothing to write about. So I suppose this is my attempt at that sort of poem, and to use the technicalities of a rhyme scheme to have a little bit of fun with it. And this one then is called Searching for Ideas. I glimpsed a glimmer of a great idea, just out of my eye, but somewhere near. So I crept over quiet, and I didn't dare speak, having hunted the beast for over a week. Then I readied my pen, but alas, that was when the monster took flight once again.
I'm just bringing Debra back in, even though I feel there's so much more, and we'd planned to talk about more, but our time is moving on, and you'll be talking to me at midnight, the pair of you, if we don't come back together again. Debra, did you enjoy listening to Simon's poems?
Oh, wow. Well, Simon, I think you're taking the poetry world by storm.
Oh.
The amount of people that I have spoken to that just adore this book. I mean, everything about it, the binding, the illustrations, the quality. And I know we've talked. I know how much you had to do with the actual design of the book and the binding. And you are a multi-talented man. And, I'm very excited for your future.
Thank you so much.
Really, I've told you that anyway.
But maybe you need to tell us a bit more then about that, because this is, again, I mentioned timelessness with The Childhood Thief. This has got a very classic look to it. We don't see many cloth-bound, what looks like a cloth-bound book. So tell us.
Scallywag were amazing, and I think there were a couple of things that filtered into this, and factored into this. One of them, I think, is the fact it is their first poetry book. So as much as I know that they really liked, and in fact, I think loved the collection, I know that they wanted to make a splash as much for themselves. This is a very exciting thing, a new publisher, a new poetry publisher as well. That's such a cool thing. So I know there was that thing of let's go in there with a splash, but to be to have been so involved in the building of it was lovely. I mean, the cover was one of the very difficult things to get right. And in the end, the design, I think, really came around from that desire to find a cover that bridged all ages. We wanted it to look like a book that kids would pick up, a kid's poetry book, and I think it's there. I think it's there in the sort of the peculiar quirkiness of the shell, and also in Chris's wonderful lettering. But also, I think it looks like an adult collection as well. And I think that was an incredibly difficult thing to achieve. And it's my hope that we did achieve it. One of the things that I've been stunned at in the last few weeks of going around, as you said, it's only a couple of weeks, it's been out a couple of months. In so many of the shops I've been in, it appears in the adult collection instead of in the children's collection. And that to me is fascinating. I'm not sure what that says on it, but I think it speaks to so many poetry books. These aren't books just for kids, are they? These are books for any reader. Debra said that earlier. You know, there's something in them for every reader, and I suppose that's our attempt to try and say that. You know, anyone can pick up that book, and no one would be embarrassed to read it. Hopefully, on the train, no one.
It's a really interesting point. For a long time, a well-known chain of children's booksellers put poetry in with joke books. It was called the Poetry and Jokes collection. I'm not saying that poetry can't be, very, very funny, and there are collections of humorous poetry, but clearly poetry is not jokes. So, this is saying something else, isn't it? And maybe that's an important message to get across. Debra, I just wanted to ask you what points of connection you saw between your work and Simon's work.
I think a passing on of shells is a very eclectic mix of poetry, quite diverse, and I think that's what we have in common. I just wondered whether I could read two short contrasting ones. Have we got time for that?
We have. Let's repay the favour. Let's put this in here.
Yes, I love them all. You know, what is not to love in this huggable, beautiful poetry book, which is beautiful inside and out. There are two contrasting ones. This one is called Macaroni Man. Let me tell you something. My dad's a pretty brilliant chef, a knockout kitchen whiz. Of all the food in all the world, the best around is his. I love his macaroni. Here's the secret of his grub. He cuts some slits into the lid, then microwaves the tub. Ping! And then there's a complete contrast, which completely blew me away when I read it. It's called A Line in the Sand, and I don't know whether you can see Chris Riddell's just, absolutely just heart-piercing illustration there. This is called A Line in the Sand. Here, take this stick, this simple stick, and draw a line in the sand. Good, good. This is your line, not mine, and now you have a choice. Step over the line, or let the sea consume it, the tide take it away. Remember, your line, your life, your choice. Ooh.
Thank you, Debra.
That illustration there by Chris Riddell, it's just
a poem that can be read in so many different situations. I'm sure that as Debra read that, each of us had a very different circumstance that we were associating with that poem, I would imagine. What was in your head when you wrote it?
I'm not sure I'm going to answer it, but I will give you something else. I'll give you something else, which is I'll remember the launch night for that poem, because I would say it's the one that made the biggest impression on the launch night. And when people were coming up to have their poems signed, there was a family, a couple, who got their books signed to their kids, and they specifically mentioned life events that were either coming up or just had happened, and they referred to them as their lines in the sand, and they wanted me to write about that. And I thought, wow, that's extraordinary. And if I may, rather than while I'm skirting your question, something I'm particularly proud of in that poem is actually probably the smallest bit in it. I really love the repeated use of the word good, because that's one of those things, isn't it, that the written word has the ability to do, and it can be read in so many different ways. And that repeated good, to me, is one I'm super proud of. Just that tiny little phrase, I
Yes.
think, for me, makes that poem.
And the number of times that children are told not to repeat words, or, simple words like good. And sometimes that's absolutely perfect, isn't it? Rather than us abiding by rules, is to think about the context in which something occurs. And it's wonderful.
Because for that word to have appeared the third time, that would have spoiled it. Good, good, good. I mean, that's that purple prose thing. But to have it twice, like you say, that's it. We should be brave enough to be allowed to do those things.
Yeah. And I can actually hear this person talking. I was acting out in my head, good. This is your line, not mine. And it is a conversation that you're playing out in your mind, and you're seeing the scene as you're actually reading it. I mean, it is an incredible poem, as many of them are, all of them are.
But I wanted to ask you, or give you the opportunity really, to talk about what's coming next. And Deborah, I know that very soon we've got a new collection from Troika. It's imminent, in fact. So do tell us a bit about that.
Yes, Troika being very patient with me as I'm editing. Yes, it's called The Moon's Gorgonzola, and it's for Key Stage 1 children. And it is, I think Roy Johnson has described it as a vibrant, bouncy collection, which I think is a very good description. It is very light-hearted and not quite as weighty as Wishes. It's more of a fun book. It does have thoughtful poems, you've also always got to include a mix. Lots of performance poems, lots of poems to act out, and also tips on how to write and learn and perform poetry.
Fantastic. And Simon, is there a new collection in the pipeline?
I'm not sure at the moment, is the honest answer, I suppose. I think we're at slightly different stages. Deborah's book has been out for a year now, and I suppose I'm still in the sort of wake of my publication. So I'm still very much school visits, and everything for me is still very much about this one, making some teaching resources for it. That's a sort of thing that I'm doing at the moment. And I think more than anything, just enjoying that it's in the world. It's a very lovely and peculiar feeling, and to hear another poet, Deborah, reading a couple of the poems aloud is such an unusual experience. I've never ever had that before. It's so weird to me, and I think rather than particularly looking ahead and leaping ahead trying to write something new, I'm just going to give myself the time to enjoy what we've got just now.
So can I invite you then to read us out of this event with the last poem?
Yeah, I will do. It was the last one that was written for the collection, much later than the rest. I thought it was done, and I suddenly had a panic and realised, no, haven't nailed this, and I've got an idea. And my family member growing up kept a collection of things, and these things were snow globes, and I always remember them very specifically on the stairway upstairs in their house. And all these years later, with all this lived life, I thought, poem, compulsion to write. Snow globes. The path upstairs was lined with snow globes, each a little capturing of a moment, a memory. In passing, each was for the tilting of a miniature world, a shaking up of old snow, sense sifting through new light. Now, I make my own snow globes and call them poems.